Hello, and thank you for watching. My name is Bradford Roberts, Principal Broker, Founder, and Owner of TR Realty in the Las Vegas area. After watching this video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. Download the pertinent handouts for this video by clicking the link in the comments below. Now let's get started. All right, folks, we have a bit of a challenge in front of us here. We are going to attempt to dissect the most current version of LVR's standard residential lease. It is imperative for you to watch this segment that you have the actual lease in front of you. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible to follow along. So please go ahead and get that form, the residential lease agreement, in front of you, and let us begin. So at the top of the very first page, it says residential lease agreement for, and we would write in the complete property address on that blank line, including the unit number if it's a condo, and we would also write in the zip code. Paragraph 1 says this agreement is entered into this blank day of some date between the owner's names. If you'll notice, there's a couple of places to put owner's names there. Collectively, herein after call the owner and or landlord, legal owners of the property, and tenants' names. And there's actually 4 spaces there to write in all of the tenants' names. But collectively, from now on, we're going to refer to all of the tenants as a tenant, which parties hereby agree to as follows. Now, I want to point out the date that we put on line 1 is the date that we are drafting the lease. It is not going to be the date that we're expecting occupancy, because that would require us to post-date this form, which of course we cannot do. So there's the date that we're drafting the document, the owner's name and tenant's name in paragraph 1. Let's move on to paragraph 2, which says premises. Landlord hereby leases to tenant, and tenant hereby leases from landlord, subject to the terms and conditions of the lease. The premises known and designated as, and strangely, on line 9, even though we already put it on this page, we're going to write in the full address of the property once again. And continuing on lines 10 and 11, you'll see there's spaces for mailbox number, parking space number, storage unit number, or anything else that might be relevant. We want to get as much information in there as we possibly can. Paragraph 3 is the term of the lease. It says the term hereof shall commence on and continue until. So this is the dates of occupancy. This is the dates that we are going to hold the tenant responsible for payment of the rent and performance of the lease. My recommendation is a year. However, that's a recommendation. It could be, 6 months. It could be 5 years. It could be anything like that. But typically, most residential leases in Nevada are done for 1 year at a time. With a total rent of, you'll see that on line 14, total rent means the value of this entire contract. It is not the monthly rent. It is the total rent that the tenant would be responsible for over the life of this contract. Then on a month-to-month basis thereafter, until either party shall terminate the same by giving the other party 30 days written notice delivered by U.S. mail or electronic mail, email, right? So I want to pause for just a moment and explain how important that sentence really is. Because we have kind of a unique situation here in Nevada with this standard lease. In most of the country, a lease has a beginning and a lease has an end. And someone, who's occupying that property has the obligation to get out of it by the end of the lease, unless the parties negotiate an extension of the lease or a new lease or something like that. However, the lease that we use, the standard LVR lease, says that if neither party gives 30-day written notice, this lease automatically reverts to month-to-month status. That's a really, really big deal, because there's a lot of tenants who come here from other states, and again, they're used to a lease that starts and ends. Nobody has to give notice. It's a contract, and we're performing as per the terms of the contract. As long as we're out of the contract by the end of the lease, we should be good, right? But not here. This is automatically going to go month to month. So here's what can happen. In Nevada, somebody can move into a property on a 1-year lease. By the end of month 12, they simply vacate the property. They think they're going to get their security deposit back. All of a sudden, month 13 rent is due. How could that be? Well, because the tenant failed to give a 30-day written notice to the landlord. And failing to give that 30-day written notice to the landlord means automatically this lease is going to go on a month-by-month basis, and the tenant is now responsible for month 13. So if you're not paying attention, this could be pretty painful, right? And let's make matters worse, because later in this form, I'm going to explain to you how typically, if the lease reverts to month-to-month status, the rent actually goes up. So not only is that tenant going to be responsible for month 13, and he may have already vacated the property, but month 13 could actually be at a significantly higher rent than the lease was originally, all right? So that's why there's a lot of ramifications here in paragraph 3. That's why I went slow to make sure that I explain it carefully. And it says at the end of line 15, all calculations will be based on a 30-day month. So yes, for purposes of the lease, whether it's February or August, every month has 30 days, and that's how it will be prorated. Let's take a look at paragraph number 4, which is rent. Tenant agrees to pay without demand. Whenever you see the phrase without demand, it means that no one is under the obligation to send the tenant a bill, okay? Without demand. We're not going to ask you for the rent. You need to know when your rent is due, how much is due, where you need to pay it, etc. That's what that means. Tenant agrees to pay without demand to landlord as rent for the premises the total sum of blank per month. So you see that the words per month are bolded there on line 19 because now is the first time we are actually getting into the monthly rent. And it goes on to say on the first day of each calendar month as periodic rent on line 20. Now, if you are doing this lease as a courtesy listing, the address that we put on line 20 is going to be the address for the landlord, not TR Realty. If TR Realty will be managing the property, then and only then will we have the legal right to collect the rent, in which case we should use our corporate headquarters office, 1820 East Sahara Avenue, Suite 101, Las Vegas, Nevada, 89104. But again, do not use the address of the brokerage if this is a courtesy rental listing, or at some such other place as landlord may designate in writing. Let's move on to paragraph 5, which can be a bit tricky and is certainly a bit lengthy. Paragraph 5 is a summary of the initial rents, charges, and deposits. So paragraph 5 is a financial breakdown of everything that the tenant needs to bring to the table in order to move into the property. So a couple of these things, quite frankly, I don't think are worded very well, and we can't mess with LVR's forms, but they're open to interpretation, and I will explain. Starting with line 27, it says rent from to. So here, we're going to put a start date and an end date that is the initial rent. So if you've got a tenant moving in, let's say on the 1st of the month, chances are you want him to pay the initial rent equal to the whole month's rent. What if you've got a tenant moving in on the 25th of the month? We have the right to prorate and charge the tenant for the last 5 days of the month. Or in some cases, we have the right to waive the last 5 days of the last 5 days of the month, and give that to the tenant gratis if we choose to do so. But however we are choosing to charge the tenant, the initial rent, what we want him to pay up front is what is going to go on line 27. So the dates go first. And then if you look at the form, you'll notice that there are 3 columns out to the right. The first column is the total. The second column is the amount, if any, that has already been received. And that would leave the third column for any balance due. Okay? So another way to look at this is the first column minus the second column must equal the third column. And back to line 27, when we put in the dates for the rent, we put in the total amount of that rent that we want that tenant to pay before move-in in the first column. The second column, if we've received any rent so far, it would go there. And then the balance, the first column minus the second column, would go where it says balance due on line 27. 28 is the security deposit. So the total amount goes in the first spot. And then again, anything that's been received already, subtracted from the total, is going to leave the balance due. And that is just security deposit, no other deposits on that line. Line 29 is the key deposit, which is pretty self-explanatory. And if you remember from my earlier video here in class 8, deposit is something that is potentially refundable. Fee is not going to be refundable. And that's why following key deposit, it says key fee. And then in parentheses, it says non-refundable. Sometimes tenants are charged deposits for keys. It's up to the landlord and or the property manager to make that decision. Sometimes you're charged key fees because upon move out, we are automatically going to rekey that property, which of course is always the smart thing to do. Line 31 talks about the administrative or credit application fee, which of course is non-refundable. And here at TR Realty, in order to get to the point we are right now, which is the lease, they had to have paid that application fee up front, and that's already been covered in my videos. Line 32 is a pet deposit, and 33 is a pet fee. So again, the difference between deposit and fee, and I want to remind you, under no circumstances could you ever collect pet rent or pet deposit for a service or emotional support animal, okay? They're not pets. These things would not apply. It would be a violation of federal law. And then we also have the cleaning fee and the cleaning deposit. You already know the difference. Line 36 is an interesting phrase. It's additional security. Now, people interpret that different ways. I mentioned that some of these are open to interpretation. I'll tell you how I interpret additional security, and that's not as a security deposit at all, but advance rent. So we are putting up security, meaning we are giving the landlord or property manager more comfort in selecting this tenant. Perhaps they have some credit dings or maybe short time on the job or whatever reason, they are giving the landlord additional security. So what's commonly referred to as last month's rent, I think would go in this particular space. Then we have on line 37 a utility proration. In many cases, we charge utilities over and above the cost of the rent. Of course, that has to be disclosed up front. If you are a realtor watching this video, it has to be disclosed in MLS up front as well before we even take an application from the tenant. They need to know what expenses they'll be incurring, right? And in many cases, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, it would be prudent for the landlord to keep some of the utilities in his own name. We'll talk about why, but that would be the situation primarily where we would use line 37 and 38 for that matter, the sewer and trash prorations as well. Line 39 says prepaid rent. So prepaid rent, again, would be another type of giving comfort to the landlord. Maybe the tenant needed to do that because of his credit or employment situation or eviction history. Also, there are some people who just like to prepay the rent. We have, example, military personnel. They might leave and go on active duty for a long time. They might choose to prepay several months' worth of rent. We even have some tenants who pay an entire year's worth of rent up front. We have some corporate tenants who do that. We also have some people who have difficulty proving their or verifying their income, so they might pay their rent up front as well. And that's the kind of thing that we would put on line 39. Line 40 is another opportunity to do prorated rent. So again, kind of a little ambiguous here, but you could use line 40 in conjunction with line 27. So one way to do that is on line 27, you could put rent from the first of next month until the end of next month. But then on line 40, you could put prorated rent for the rest of this month, as an example. And folks, not every one of these needs to be filled in, okay? It might not be pertinent to this particular situation. And then we've got 3 lines for other. If there's any other way that you wish to break down the finances, I've even seen things like tenants putting deposits on furniture as an example. We could use these blank lines. And down on line 45, this would be our totals of the 3 columns. So the total of the totals, if you will, followed by the total amount of everything that's been received. And lastly, on line 45 would be the total of any balances that are still due. And down the bottom of page 1, and the bottom of every page for that matter, the property address appears yet again. Now, if you're using the transaction desk to fill out your paperwork as you typically should, this property address is going to auto-populate for you. And then owner's name, tenant's name, initials. We definitely need initials on every single page of the lease. That's really, really important. So this little paragraph here, full of blank space, gives us one more option to put in anything that is financially related. So as you can see, it is pretty much a blank space. If there's something that we need to write out in words, we couldn't do that in paragraph 5, so that's where we would go ahead and do that in paragraph 6. Another example would be for furniture, to come back to the furniture example, right? So we could, take a security deposit on furniture, we could charge rent for furniture, and we could actually go ahead and construct language for that in paragraph 6. Let's take a look at paragraph 7, which is additional fees. And recently, I've had to change how I teach this paragraph. The reason I've had to change it is because of the way the courts have been handling late fees and that sort of thing. As Nevada continues to become a more and more liberal state, as I mentioned earlier, we have been a conservative state. We've been one that's very investor and landlord friendly. We are gradually becoming more and more like our neighbors to the left. California, of course, is very tenant friendly, not very landlord friendly at all. So maybe the 2 states can get together and come up with some middle ground. So let us delve into paragraph 7, which says additional fees. 7A says late fees. In the event tenant fails to pay rent when due, tenant shall pay a late fee of, and then we can choose either a dollar amount or we can put a percentage of the periodic rent. Now, this is a prime example of what I was saying a minute ago, how the judicial branch of our government has changed the way I have to teach this. Because right now, we have a law in Nevada that caps the late fee at 5% of the periodic rent, or in most cases, that would be the monthly rent. Okay? So that's also why when I finish the lease in this video, I need to go and explain something else about those late fees. And I'm going to refer back to this. You're probably going to hear me say, hey, remember when we were doing paragraph 7A, we were talking about late fees? So, just maybe make a little mark on this paragraph so you know that's what I'm going to be referring to later in this video. But whether you're expressing it as a dollar amount or as a percentage of the rent, the late fee in Nevada now cannot exceed 5% of that periodic rent. And then the other sentence there on line 10 says, late fees begin on the blank day. It is my recommendation for late fees to begin on the 6th day. I think that we want to give people up until the 5th of the month to be able to pay their rent to us without facing any kind of a penalty. Everybody needs a little bit of wiggle room somewhere. We can't be too stringent with our fellow man, right? So my recommendation there is to begin those late fees on the 6th of the month. Paragraph 7b is about dishonored checks. And a dishonored check is one that is returned for whatever reason. Could be insufficient funds, could be uncollected funds, could be the check was ripped and we can't read the routing numbers on the bottom of the check. It could be that someone forgot to sign the check, or whatever reason. All of those things would constitute a dishonored check, okay? And the paragraph says a charge of blank dollars shall be imposed for each dishonored check made by tenant to landlord. My recommendation here is $50. Now, some of you might think $50 is low, especially on a high-end rental. But here's the thing: if we charge a egregious fee for a dishonored check, the judge is going to throw it out, and we're going to get nothing. Okay, so we need to be reasonable. We can't be too punitive when it comes to assessing these fees. So $50, I think, is the number that sounds right. It goes on to say, tenant agrees to pay all rents, all late fees, all notice fees, and all costs to honor a return check with certified funds. So folks, remember, writing a check is a privilege. A check is, in fact, not a payment at all, right? A check is a promise of a payment. When you write a check to someone, you are promising that when they negotiate that piece of paper through their financial institution, that there will be sufficient funds, I should say, on account to make that payment. So check is a promise. Well, once there's a dishonored check, it is tantamount to a broken promise. And that's why it says here that all rents, late fees, etc. have to be paid with certified funds. And then it says, after tenant has tendered a check which is dishonored, tenant hereby agrees to pay all remaining payments, including rent due under this agreement, by certified funds. So not just one-time replacement of the bad check, and then next month we can write another bad check. No, once you've broken your promise and the check has been dishonored, all subsequent payments must be by certified funds. And then it says, any payments tendered to landlord thereafter which are not in the form of certified funds shall be treated as if tenant failed to make said payment until certified funds are received. I've seen it where tenants will stick a check in the mail thinking that, well, they're going to get the check, they're going to cash the check. Or sometimes we come into the office and there's checks that are slipped under the door at night, thinking that, again, they don't have to be bothered getting a certified check. They'll just pass us a regular check. That's why this language is in here. You can drop a check at the front desk and you can run away before we can say anything to you. You can put it in the mail. You can send it by carrier pigeon. The fact remains, once you've had a dishonored check, unless you pay by certified funds, you're going to be treated as if your rent was not paid at all. It says, landlord presumes a tenant is aware of the criminal sanctions and penalties for issuance of a check which tenant knows is drawn upon insufficient funds and which is tendered for the purpose of committing a fraud upon a creditor. 7C, additional rent. All dishonored check charges shall be due when incurred. Got that? Dishonored check charges shall be due when incurred and shall become additional rent. So even if you replace a bad check with certified funds, if you don't include the fee for the bad check in your certified funds, you have not paid the rent completely. And it says, this is a really important sentence coming up on line 22, which is why it's bold. And I see tons and tons of issues over this very sentence. It says, payments will be applied to charges which become rent in the order accumulated. So as an example, if a tenant owes a fee from last month, and this month comes around and they pay the rent in full, actually what's going to happen is part of that rent that they paid right now is going to go to cover the last month's fee that they owed, meaning they haven't paid the current month's rent in full. They can receive a notice. They are subject to eviction. They're subject to late fees again. So that's why this is bold. Payments will be applied to charges which become rent in the order accumulated. All unpaid charges or any fees owed by tenant, including but not limited to notice fees, attempt to evict fees, attorney's fees, repair bills, utility bills, landscape pool repair and maintenance bills, and CIC fines, will become additional rent at the beginning of the month after the tenant is billed. So those things would be due in the subsequent month. Tenant's failure to pay the full amount for a period may result in the initiation of eviction proceedings. Landlord's acceptance of any late fee or dishonored check fee shall not act as a waiver of any default of tenant or as an extension of the date on which rent is due. I know some people think that if they make a partial payment or whatever, they're going to be okay. They're not going to be okay. It is not a waiver of default at all. And by the way, when you're a property manager and you work for the owner, you have the right to collect as much money as you can for that owner. Chances are we would never turn down a partial payment. Now, that's not going to protect the tenant, but who do we owe our loyalty to? It's going to be the property owner, our client. So we are going to want to go ahead and take those partial payments, okay? And then it says landlord reserves the right to exercise any other rights and remedies under this agreement or as provided by law. So that is a very impactful paragraph 7. Let's move on to paragraph 8, which talks about security deposits. Upon execution of this agreement, and then we've got a place to put up to 4 different tenants' names, shall deposit with landlord as a security deposit the sum stated in paragraph 5. So go ahead, flip back to page 1, take a look at where they're referring to here, paragraph 5. Now, something I want to point out here about the security deposit. The security deposit belongs to the tenant. That might seem obvious to you, but if the tenant, singular, consists of 2 or more people, we cannot assume an equitable share. In other words, if there's a security deposit put up by a husband and wife, we can't assume that the husband put up 50% of the security deposit and the wife put up the other 50% of the security deposit. And the reason I mention this is because when it comes time for move out, we are going to have to issue, if they're entitled to it, we're going to have to issue a refund of the security deposit to the tenant, meaning to the collective group. We can't issue a security deposit to just one person who's on the lease and ignore the other person. We would have to get some pretty solid proof, maybe even a notarized statement. We can't trust an email, we can't trust a phone call, we can't trust a text, we can't trust a letter in the mail. For us to release that entire security deposit to one of the individuals named on the lease. Sometimes, unfortunately, during the tenancy, there's a divorce or roommates separate, go their own separate way or whatever, and then the security deposit becomes a point of battle between them. But we can't get involved, we can't choose sides, so we're going to have to make that security deposit check payable to the entire group of tenants, and unfortunately they're going to have to be left to sort that out. It is that group of tenants that posted the security deposit. It is that group of tenants who, if entitled, are going to get their security deposit refunded. It goes on to say, tenants shall not apply the security deposit to or in lieu of rent. Okay, security is security, rent is rent. Security deposit funds are the property of the tenant unless and until such time as we are able to convert them for other purposes, such as damage to the property or unpaid rent. But rent is the property of the landlord. So those are completely separate types of funds, and by the way, they are held in separate trust accounts. At any time during the term of this agreement and upon termination of the tenancy by either party for any reason, The landlord may claim from the security deposit such amounts due landlord under this agreement. Any termination prior to the initial term set forth in paragraph 3 or failure of tenant to provide proper notice of termination is a default in the payment of rent for the remainder of the lease term, which may, I said may, be offset by the security deposit. We don't even have to use that security deposit toward the rent. If somebody abandons a property during the tenancy, not only do they owe all the rest of the rent for the remainder of the lease, unless we can get another tenant in that property, and by the way, we're under no obligation to even attempt to do so, but we can also retain the security deposit simply as a punitive measure for breach of the lease. We don't even have to apply it to unpaid rent, okay? Pursuant to Nevada law, landlord shall provide tenant with a written itemized accounting of the disposition of the security deposit within 30 days of surrender of premises. So Nevada law says within 30 days of move out. It doesn't say within 30 days of the end of the lease. It says within 30 days of move out for any reason, the property owner or the property manager acting on his behalf must provide a written statement to the tenant that explains either why his entire security deposit is forfeit, or why some of his security deposit is forfeit, and then we would have to explain in detail what we are withholding money for, or we would have to refund the entire security deposit. So those are the options, but they all must be exercised within 30 days of move out. Either the tenant gets all of the deposit back, the tenant gets none of the deposit back along with an explanation, or the tenant gets some of the deposit back also along with an explanation. But those things have to happen within 30 days. And by the way, Nevada law says if the property owner or property manager fails to provide that written notice and or security deposit funds within 30 days of move out, now the tenant is legally entitled to his entire security deposit to be refunded, even if he completely destroyed the property, even if he owes a whole bunch of back rent, he would be entitled to that security deposit. So we want to make sure that we always provide notice within 30 days of move out, and we never want to miss that deadline. The paragraph goes on to say, at the termination of this agreement, the tenant identified in this paragraph will be refunded the remaining security deposit, if any. Well, I've covered that already. In the event of damage to the premises caused by tenant or tenant's family, agents, or visitors, landlord may use funds from the deposit to repair, but is not limited to this fund, and tenant remains liable for any remaining costs. Means the tenant can be billed and even sent to collections if the costs exceed the amount of security deposit on account. And then it says, in addition to the above, to be refundable, property must be professionally cleaned to include carpets and all hard surface flooring, including tile and grout. I think this is pretty strict. And, I hope that there's some flexibility here, treating other humans as humans, right? But if we use this standard LVR lease, it says that the tenant has to have the carpets and hardwood floors, including tile and grout, professionally cleaned for the security deposit to be refundable. I know some of you are shaking your head. I'm doing the same thing myself. And then it says on line 46, upon request by landlord, tenant must furnish receipts for professional cleaning services. All right, moving on to page 3, paragraph 9, the condition of premises. Tenant agrees that tenant has examined the premises, including the grounds and all buildings and improvements, and that they are, at the time of this lease, in good order, good repair, safe, clean, and rentable condition. We need to be careful when a tenant signs this lease because of this paragraph. It's saying that the tenant has already had a chance to check everything out and everything is acceptable. So the argument could be made here that, if the tenant moves in and then complains about something not working correctly, the landlord or property manager could always go back and say, hey, you signed the lease, including paragraph 9 that says you checked everything out and it's to your liking. So I know that this paragraph has caused quite a bit of consternation with tenants in the past. So I just want to point that out to you. Paragraph 10 talks about trust accounts. Broker shall retain all interest earned, if any, on security deposits to offset administration and bookkeeping fees. TR Realty has no interest-bearing accounts. I made a decision back in 2011 when we opened our property management division. I made a decision that I would not have interest-bearing accounts. Something about it just doesn't smell right to me. When you're holding other people's money, if you have an interest-bearing account, obviously the longer you hold it, the more interest you earn. So I never wanted that type of allegation, and that's why none of our accounts bear interest. Paragraph 11 talks about eviction costs. Tenant shall be charged an administrative fee of blank dollars per eviction attempt to offset the costs of eviction notices and proceedings. My recommendation here in Nevada is $400. There are hard costs when you file for eviction, court costs, and we have to make sure those things are covered. So $400, my recommendation. And then, very important sentence, it says, tenant shall be charged for service of legal notices and all related fees according to actual costs incurred. So it would be a violation for a property manager, property management company, property owner to mark up the cost of serving notice. And we're going to talk about serving notice in my next video here in Class 8. But we have to charge the actual cost. If you think about it, if we could mark up the cost of a notice, we would just claim that we never got anybody's rent, right? We'd be serving notices all day long so we could generate profit on that. So that's why we can't do that. And like it says here, the cost of legal notices are charged without any kind of a markup to the tenant whatsoever. Paragraph 12, cards and keys. Upon execution of the agreement, tenant shall receive the following. And then there's places for door keys, mailbox keys, laundry room keys, gate transmitters, etc. You can read all of these yourself. I do not recommend that we put a check mark or an X. I recommend that we put an actual number, a number of keys or fobs or transmitters, etc., that we are giving to the tenant. On line 16, it says, tenant shall make a key deposit, if any, in the amount set forth in paragraph 2 upon execution of this agreement. The key deposit shall be refunded within 30 days of tenant's return of all cards and or keys to landlord or landlord's designated property manager or broker. So they would have 30 days to return the keys after move out if they were expecting a key deposit to be returned to them. If they don't return everything within 30 days, then of course we have the right to rekey the property and retain that key deposit. Paragraph 13 talks about conveyances and uses. Tenant shall not assign, sublet, or transfer tenant's interest, nor any part thereof, without prior written consent of landlord. So we are agreeing to rent the property to a specific tenant. The tenant cannot then turn around and rent that property to someone else and act as a de facto landlord of his own, okay? That's what subletting is. Assignability is simply, turning the property and the responsibility for the lease from one person to another person, assigning their rights to the property. None of that can happen as per this lease without the written consent of the landlord in advance. It says the premises shall be used and occupied by tenant exclusively as a private single-family residence. Neither the premises nor any part of the premises or yard shall be used at any time during the term of this lease for any purpose of carrying on any business, profession, or trade of any kind, or for any purpose other than as a private single-family residence. Tenants shall comply with all the health and sanitary laws ordinances, rules, and orders of appropriate governmental authorities and homeowners associations, if any, with respect to the premises. Tenant understands and acknowledges that they are not permitted to access the attic crawl space, roof, or under the home, or any other area of the property that is not considered living space. Tenant shall not commit waste, cause excessive noise, create a nuisance, or disturb others. All right, paragraph 14 talks about occupants. So occupants is different than a responsible person. An occupant is simply somebody who's going to occupy the property. And here in paragraph 14, line 31, it says occupants of the premises shall be limited to blank persons. We need a number in there, and shall be used solely for housing accommodations and for no other purpose. Tenant represents that the following persons will live in the premises. And then you can see there's a couple of blank lines where we literally write in people's names. So the number that we put on 31, the names that we put on 33 and 34 are reflective of everyone who's going to occupy the property. Even a child would go here as an occupant. Paragraph 15, the tenant agrees to pay the sum of blank dollars per day for each guest remaining on the premises more than some number of days. Well, we need to distinguish between a visitor and a resident. And that's what this paragraph is all about. At what point does a guest become a resident, right? So my recommendation on line 36 is to put $25 per day, and then on line 37, 14 days. So what that means is anyone can come and visit up to 14 days, no additional fee, and that would be that for their visit. If they want to stay more than 14 days, the fee that I indicated here is going to kick in. And then it says, notwithstanding the foregoing, which means no matter what we just said, notwithstanding the foregoing, in no event shall any guest remain on the premises for more than blank number of days. My recommendation here is 30. So even after the 14 days that I recommended, if the tenant is willing to pay that $25 per diem for the guest to stay on the property, in no event can they stay more than the 30 days that I'm recommending. Because folks, at that point, they're moving in, and we definitely want an application on that person. We want to run their background check. We want to make sure that the tenant is not acting as a straw renter. We need to protect the property. We need to protect the owner. So that's my recommendations in paragraph 15. Let's look at 16, which talks about utilities. Tenant shall immediately connect all utilities and services of premises upon commencement of lease. Tenant is to pay when due all utilities and other charges in connection with tenant's individual rented premises. Responsibility is described as T for tenant or O for owner. And then on lines 43 through 45, we see electricity, gas, sewer, trash, septic, water, etc., etc. And all of these need to be filled in with a T, meaning the tenant is responsible, or O, the owner is responsible, okay? Now this has nothing to do with payment. Now this paragraph has to do with who is responsible for the payment of these utilities. It is not indicating whose name the utility is in, all right? So who is going to pay the cable bill? Who is going to pay association fees? Who's going to pay trash can rental, as an example? T for tenant, O for owner. And continuing on to page 4, now we get into the responsibility of which utilities we want the tenant to connect in his own name. Now, some of you might be thinking, hell, the tenant should turn everything on in his own name. I don't think that's a very wise decision, especially when it comes to water in most municipalities, sewer, and trash. Why are those three different than, let's say, a phone bill, a gas bill, an electric bill? Because those are veritable monopolies, water, sewer, trash, and they have the right to put a lien on the property. You know, other things like, let's say, a cable bill, if the tenant fails to pay and the tenant moves out, well, the bill is going to follow the tenant. However, when it comes to water, sewer, and trash in most places, the bill follows the property. So that's why a lot of savvy landlords and property managers choose to keep water, sewer, and trash in the landlord's name so that if that bill is not paid, they're going to be notified and it can't result as a very costly lien on the property. 16B, landlord will maintain the connection of the following utilities in landlord's name and bill tenant for connection fees and use accordingly for the entire term of the lease. So kind of the converse of 16A. Paragraph C, no additional phone or cable lines or outlets or satellite dishes shall be obtained for the premises without the landlord's written consent. In the event of landlord's consent, tenants shall be responsible for all costs associated with the additional lines, outlets, or dishes. Tenant shall also remove any satellite dishes and restore the subject property to its original condition at the termination of this agreement. 16D, if an alarm system exists on the premises, tenant may obtain the services of an alarm services company and shall pay all costs associated therewith. 16E, tenant shall not default on any obligation to a utility provider for utility services at the property. Owner does not pay for any utilities, excluding any such utilities that are included in homeowners association dues. Tenant must show, this is important, tenant must show all utilities giving service to said property have a zero balance upon move out. All right, so that is paragraph 16. Paragraph 17 is the pest notice. It says tenant understands that various pests, rodents, and insect species exist in southern Nevada. Yeah, they do. In fact, several of them have real estate licenses, I think. Pests may include, but are not limited to, scorpions, spiders, bees, snakes, ants, termites, rats, mice, and pigeons. The existence of pests may vary by season and location. Importantly, within 30 days of occupancy, if the premises has pests, landlord, at tenant's written request, will arrange for and pay for the initial pest control spraying. Tenant agrees to pay for the monthly pest control spraying fees. For more information on pests and pest control providers, tenant should contact the State of Nevada Division of Agriculture, right? So how that typically works, if the tenant complains within the first 30 days of tenancy that there are pests, the landlord would pay for the initial treatment, but if the problem warranted monthly treatment, the tenant would be responsible for the monthly bill. And if the tenant does not complain during the first 30 days, the tenant owns the pests. Let's move on to paragraph 18, which talks about pets. No pet shall be on or about the premises. When we say about the premises, we're talking about outside in the yard, etc. Without written permission of landlord. In the event tenant wishes to have a pet, tenant will complete an application for pet approval. And I've already covered that form in an earlier video here in class 8, that the form application for pet approval will be used subsequent to the signing of the lease, not concurrent with the signing of the lease. That's handled in the application. But once there's a lease in existence, from that point forward, if the tenant wishes to have a pet, he would need to do an application for pet approval. Should written permission be granted for occupancy of the designated pet, an additional security deposit or fee in the amount of X dollars will be required and paid by tenant in advance. So if the landlord says, or the property manager says, yes, Mr. Tenant, you can go ahead and bring this particular pet into the property, we have the right to charge security deposit or a fee. Not both, but a security deposit or a fee that is specific to that one pet. And then on line 36, we would put in an amount of money. My recommendation here is $500. If you think that's a lot, then you have not seen the damage that pets can do. Even birds can create thousands of dollars worth of damage on a property. So it goes on to say, in the event written permission shall be granted, tenant shall be required to procure and provide to landlord Written evidence that tenant has obtained such insurance as may be available against property damage to the premises and liability to third-party injury, right? What if we allow the tenant to bring a dog into the property and then the dog bites the neighbor? Now the neighbor is going to sue the landlord too, and probably the property manager. So that's why we have to have proof of insurance. And it says, said policy shall name landlord and landlord's agent as additional insureds. A copy of said policy shall be provided to landlord or landlord's broker or designated property manager prior to any pets being allowed within the premises. If tenant obtains a pet without written permission of the landlord, such will be an event of default under paragraph 21. And tenant further agrees to pay an immediate fine, and my recommendation here is another $500. Landlord reserves the right to accept or deny this pet. So in other words, if the tenant brings a pet without permission, they're going to get hit with a fine, and that still doesn't mean they can keep the pet. So that's what it says here. Landlord reserves the right to accept or deny this pet, but only after the aforementioned fee is paid. Once tenant pays the fine, tenant may complete an application for pet approval, which will be treated as if no breach had occurred. Sure, the tenant paid his fine, he filled out his application for pet approval, so everybody's happy now at this point, right? Tenant agrees to indemnify landlord for any and all liability, loss, and damages which landlord may suffer as a result of any animal in the premises, whether or not written permission was granted. Moving on to paragraph 19, which is the top of page 5. Restrictions: tenant shall not keep or permit to be kept in, on, or about the premises waterbeds, boats, campers, trailers, mobile homes, recreational or commercial vehicles, or any non-operative vehicles except as follows. So on lines 3 and 4, which are blank as you can see, we have the opportunity, in case someone comes for permission in advance, let's say they want to keep their RV or they want to keep their boat in their backyard, if it's zoned properly, if there's no association restrictions prohibiting it, if the landlord is okay with it, we could actually write those in here on lines 3 and 4 as exceptions to this provision. Paragraph 20 talks about alterations. Tenant shall make no alterations to the premises without landlord's written consent. Unless otherwise agreed in writing between tenant and landlord, all alterations or improvements to the premises become the property of the landlord, shall remain upon the premises, and shall constitute a fixture permanently affixed to the premises. So let's say, as an example, the tenant installs ceiling fans on a property during his tenancy. Well, at the time of move-out, those ceiling fans now belong to the landlord. They cannot be removed from the premises. They have been affixed, which means they have been converted from personal property to real property. They now stay on that rental property. It says, unless otherwise agreed in writing between tenant and landlord, tenant shall be responsible for restoring the premises to its original condition and removing any alterations or improvements if requested by landlord or landlord's broker or property manager. Paragraph 21 is important. It talks about default. So let's get into that right now. Failure by tenant to pay rent, perform any obligation under this agreement, or comply with the association governing documents, if any, or tenant's engagement in activity prohibited by this agreement, or tenant's failure to comply with any and all applicable laws shall be considered a default hereunder. I know when we think of default in a lease, we typically think about non-payment of rent, but there's all kinds of reasons why someone could default on a lease. It says, upon default, landlord may, at its option, terminate this tenancy upon giving proper notice. Upon default, landlord shall issue a proper itemized statement to tenant, noting the amount owed by tenant, including any and all fees related to eviction and reletting of the subject property. Reletting is another way of saying leasing it out again to someone else. Landlord may pursue any and all legal and equitable remedies available. 21A talks about the forfeiture of the security deposit. This kind of connects to something that we said earlier. It is understood and agreed the tenant shall not attempt to apply or deduct any portion of any security deposit from the last or any month's rent, or use or apply any such security deposit at any time in lieu of payment of rent. If tenant fails to comply, such security deposit shall be forfeited, and landlord may recover the rent due as if any such deposit had not been applied or deducted from the rent due. So again, the landlord or PM has the right to have that security deposit declared forfeit and not applied to the rent. It can be forfeit in addition to all of the remaining rent unless and until that property is leased out to someone else. It goes on to say, for the purpose of this paragraph, it shall be conclusively presumed that a tenant leaving the premises while owing rent is making an attempted deduction of deposits. So there you go. If they just move out at 2 o'clock in the morning, we're going to assume the property has been abandoned. The security deposit is now forfeit. And in addition to that, all of the remaining rent is going to be due. And if they don't pay it, which they probably won't, they're going to end up in collections. It says, in the event of default by tenant of any obligation in this lease which is not cured by tenant within 5 days notice from landlord, then in addition to forfeiture of the security deposit, landlord may pursue any other remedy available by law, equity, or otherwise, hence the collection agency I just referred to. 21B, tenant personal information upon default. Tenant understands and acknowledges that if tenant defaults on lease, landlord or owner may engage the services of an attorney or a collection agency. There it is. Tenant understands and acknowledges that landlord or owner may give an attorney or a collection agency tenant's personal information, including but not limited to tenant's social security number or any other information to aid in collection efforts, and holds landlord, broker, and owner harmless from any liability in relation to the release of that personal information to these entities. Okay? So caveat emptor there, right? Buyer be warned. Paragraph 22 is about enforcement. Any failure by landlord to enforce the terms of this agreement shall not constitute a waiver of said terms by landlord. Very important. Acceptance of rent due by landlord after any default shall not be construed to waive any right of landlord or affect any notice of termination or eviction. Remember what I said earlier, that we have the right to collect even partial payments. We work for the landlord, and it is our obligation to get as much money for the landlord as we possibly can. So even by taking the partial payments, we are not affecting our right to serve notice or our right to evict. 22A talks about abandonment. Landlord is entitled to presume, per Nevada law, that tenant has abandoned the premises if tenant is absent from the premises for a period of time equal to 1/2 the time for periodic rental payments, unless the rent is current or the tenant has in writing notified the landlord of an intended absence. So if the rent is current, the tenant's okay, but if the rent is in default, if the tenant disappears from the property for a period of time that exceeds half the periodic rent, so periodic rent, typically monthly, a period of time of half the periodic rent, so a couple of weeks or so, if the tenant is gone from the property more than that time, the landlord or property manager might deem the property to have been abandoned. If at any time during the term of this lease tenant abandons the premises, landlord shall have the following rights. Landlord may, at landlord's option, enter the premises by any means without liability to tenant for damages, and may re-let the premises for the whole or any part of the then unexpired term, and may receive and collect all rent payable by virtue of such reletting. Yeah, tenant could disappear if his rent is in arrears, disappear for a period of time, come back, and find that he no longer has a rental property. Somebody else could be living in it, okay? At landlord's option, landlord may hold tenant liable for any difference between the rent that would have been payable under this lease during the balance of the unexpired term if this lease had continued in force, and the net rent for such period realized by landlord by means of such reletting. So, as per Nevada law, we cannot collect rent from two tenants on the same property at the same time. So if the first tenant abandons the property, breaches the lease, whatever, he's going to be responsible for the rent through the end of the original lease unless we put another tenant in place. And even though that tenant breached the lease, if we put another tenant in place, the day that other tenant begins paying the rent is the day that the first tenant is now off the hook for the balance of the rent. And you might be thinking, why would we even bother to put another tenant in the property? Why don't we just hold the first tenant responsible? Well, we have every right to do that, but what do you think realistically are the chances that we're ever going to collect that money, right? We can put that tenant into collections, we can destroy his credit, we can go further, we can sue him, we could garnish him, but this is an awful lot of expense, an awful lot of trouble, and an awful lot of time. So in most cases, even though there's been a breach or abandonment, we do try to find a replacement tenant, and then that would terminate that first tenant's liability. On line 10, it says landlord also may dispose of any of tenant's abandoned personal property pursuant to Nevada law as landlord deems appropriate without liability to tenant. So if you're a tenant watching this video and your rent is behind, I recommend you don't disappear for a long period of time lest it be considered abandonment of the property. Let's move on to paragraph 23, notice of intent to vacate. Tenant shall provide notice of tenant's intention to vacate the premises. Now, folks, anytime you see something that's bold and underlined, you better pay close attention. Such notice shall be in writing and shall be provided to landlord prior to the first day of the last month of the lease term set forth in Section 3 of this agreement. So, prior to the first day of the last month of the lease. So assuming the lease was on a calendar basis, January 1st through December 31st, just to give an easy example, the tenant would need to give written notice that he wishes to terminate the lease December 31st, no later than November 30th, okay? So prior to the first day of the last month of the lease, November 30th in my example. It goes on to say, in no event shall notice be less than 30 days prior to the expiration of the term of this agreement. In the event tenant fails to provide such notice, tenant shall be deemed to be holding over on a month-to-month basis. This circles back to something we talked about toward the beginning of this video, where I said in Nevada, this lease will go month to month, and I also said the rent can increase in that case. Well, it says it right here on line 18. During a holdover not authorized by landlord, rent shall increase by, my recommendation here is 10%, but actually the state of Nevada has no regulation on the percentage of the increase. And I have seen leases written for 100%. So that would be a doubling of the rent if that tenant fails to provide notice prior to the first day of the last month. So any tenants watching this video, you better pay attention. You better read paragraph 23. And if you have questions on that, you might want to contact an attorney, because there can be a lot of ramifications for you here. Paragraph 24, upon termination of the tenancy, tenant shall surrender and vacate the premises and shall remove any and all of tenant's property. Tenant shall return keys, personal property, and premises to the landlord in good, clean, and sanitary condition, normal where accepted. Paragraph 25 is for emergencies. Name, address, and phone number of the party who will handle maintenance or essential services emergencies on behalf of the landlord is as follows. So this would be the property manager's information if the property was being professionally managed, or sometimes the landlord will just designate another family member or business associate in the case of emergency. Paragraph 26 is about maintenance. This is a really important paragraph, and this is another paragraph that can trigger a lot of disputes. So please listen to this one very carefully. Tenant shall keep the premises in a clean and good condition. Tenant shall immediately report to the landlord any defect or problem on the premises. Yeah, don't send us an email and say, well, my dishwasher hasn't been working for 5 months. You have to immediately report any problem. Tenant agrees to notify landlord of any water leakage and/or damage within 24 hours of the occurrence. Tenant understands that tenant may be held responsible for any water and/or mold damage, including the costs of remediation of such damage. That's why we need the tenant to tell us right away. Think, if this language didn't exist in the lease and the tenant didn't tell us about a leak for a few weeks, think of the damage that could ensue, right? So it goes on to say, tenant shall be responsible for any minor, the word minor is capitalized and bolded for a reason. Tenant shall be responsible for any minor repairs necessary to the premises up to and including the cost of blank. So in our industry, we refer to this as a repair threshold, meaning if a repair costs less than the amount of money we write here in line 33, that repair is going to be the tenant's responsibility. And conversely, if the cost of a repair exceeds the amount we write here, it's going to be the landlord's responsibility. And my recommendation here is $200. So any minor repair that costs under $200 is going to have to be borne by the tenant. Anything greater will be paid by the landlord. And there's a lot of people who read this paragraph and misunderstand it to mean that the tenant is responsible for the first $200. It's not a deductible. It simply says if the cost of the repair is less than this amount, it's a tenant responsibility. If it's more than this amount, it's a landlord responsibility. It says tenant agrees to pay for all repairs, replacements, and maintenance required by tenant's misconduct or negligence, or that of tenant's family, pets, licensees, and guests, including but not limited to any damage done by wind or rain caused by leaving windows open and or by overflow of water, stoppage of waste pipes, or any other damage to appliances, carpeting, or the premises in general. At landlord's option, such charges shall be paid immediately or be regarded as additional rent to be paid no later than the next monthly payment date following such repairs. Tenant acknowledges any minor repairs made to the property must be done by an active, licensed, and insured contractor. The tenant just can't pull out his toolbox and do the repair himself and then expect that the landlord's going to be responsible for payment of that repair. 26A, tenant shall change filters in the heating and air conditioning systems at least once every month at tenant's own expense. Landlord shall maintain the heating and AC systems and provide for major repairs. However, any repairs to the heating or cooling system caused by dirty filters due to tenant neglect will be the responsibility of the tenant. So in the case that the tenant fails to change the filters, if that's the cause of damage to the system, the tenant is going to own the damage to the system. 26B, tenant shall replace all broken glass regardless of cause of damage at tenant's expense. 26C, landlord shall be responsible for any systems, including heating, cooling, electrical, plumbing, and sewer lines. Landlord shall be responsible for all major heating, cooling, electrical, plumbing, and sewer problems that are not caused by the tenant. 26D, there is or is not a landscape contractor whose name and phone number are as follows. So we have to indicate here whether there's a landscape contractor, and if there is one, who it is. And then it says, in the case of landscaping being maintained by a contractor, tenant agrees to cooperate with the landscape contractor in a satisfactory manner. That might mean unlocking the back gate. It might mean keeping your dog inside. Landlord-provided landscaping is not to be construed as a waiver of any responsibility of the tenant to keep and maintain landscaping and/or shrubs, trees, and sprinkler system in good condition. In the event the landscaping is not being maintained by a contractor, tenant shall maintain lawns, shrubs, and trees. Tenant shall water all lawns, shrubs, and trees, mow the lawns on a regular basis, trim the trees, and fertilize lawns, shrubs, and trees. If tenant fails to maintain the landscaping in a satisfactory manner, landlord may have the landscaping maintained by a landscaping contractor and charge the tenant with the actual cost. Said cost shall immediately become additional rent. 26E goes on to talk about whether there is or is not a pool contractor, and basically the same rules are going to apply as the landscaping. On line 26 it says, in the event the pool is not being maintained by a contractor, tenant agrees to maintain the pool, if any. Tenant agrees to maintain the water level, sweep, clean, and keep in good condition. If tenant fails to maintain the pool in a satisfactory manner, landlord may have the pool maintained by a licensed pool service and charge the tenant, just like the landscaping. And 26F, smoking will or will not be permitted on or about the premises, even outside. Tenant will be charged any costs incurred for the abatement of any damages by unauthorized smoking in the premises. Folks, remember that smoking is not a protected class. The landlord has every right to say smoking will not be permitted in or about the premises, and it must be respected. All right, paragraph 27 is the smoke detector agreement. This used to be a separate standalone form, but it has now been incorporated into the lease. It says landlord and tenant agree that the premises are equipped with smoke detection devices. That's the law. It's not yes or no, is or is not. That's the law. Tenant shall agree as follows. A, it is agreed the tenant will test the smoke detectors within 24 hours after occupancy and inform landlord or his or her agent immediately if detector is not working properly. B, it is agreed that tenant will be responsible for testing smoke detector weekly by pushing the push to test button on the detector for about 5 seconds to be operating properly. Alarm will sound when the button is pushed. 27C, tenant understands that said smoke detector is a battery-operated unit, and it shall be tenant's responsibility to ensure, it should say ensure, not insure, but this is an LVR form and we can't make changes to it, that the battery is in operating condition at all times. If after replacing battery, any smoke detector will not operate or has no sound, tenant must inform landlord or his or her agent immediately in writing. 27D, landlord and his or her agent recommend that tenant provide and maintain a fire extinguisher on the premises. 27E, the undersigned have read the above agreement and understand and agree to all provisions thereof, and further acknowledge they have received a copy of said agreement. You know, I digress, but all LVR did was to take the language from the standalone smoke detector agreement and copy and paste it. And that's why E doesn't make any sense, right? Received a copy of said agreement. There is no agreement anymore. It's incorporated into the lease. And 27F, tenant shall not under any circumstances remove, disable, or tamper with any smoke detection device. That would be pretty stupid if you did that. Moving on to 28. Access. Tenant agrees to grant landlord the right to enter the premises at all reasonable times and for all reasonable purposes, including showing to prospective lessees, buyers, appraisers, insurance agents, periodic maintenance reviews, and business therein as requested by landlord. If tenant fails to keep scheduled appointments with vendors to make necessary or required repairs, then tenant shall pay for any additional charges incurred which will then become part of the next month's rent and be considered additional rent. Tenant shall not deny landlord his or her rights of reasonable entry to the premises. Landlord shall have the right to enter in case of emergency and other situations as specifically allowed by law. Landlord agrees to give tenant 24-hour notification for entry, except in case of emergency. And folks, in case of emergency, no notice is required whatsoever. 28A is a display of signs. During the last 30 days of this lease, landlord or landlord's agent may display for sale or for rent or similar signs on or about the premises and enter to show the premises to prospective purchasers or tenants. Tenant also authorizes broker to use an electronic key box to show the premises during the last 30 days of the lease. Now, just a point here, if we wish to put a lockbox on the property before the last 30 days, we're going to need not just the landlord, but the tenant's written consent as well. And there is a form available to us specifically for that purpose. But if we are putting a lockbox on the property during the last 30 days of the tenancy, we do not need to use that form. All right? It says tenant further agrees to execute any and all documentation necessary to facilitate the use of the lockbox. Well, I just referred to that. Paragraph 29 has to do with associations, if there are any associations. Should the premises described herein be a part of a common interest community, homeowners association, planned unit development, condominium development, or such, tenant hereby agrees to abide by the governing documents, including declarations, bylaws, articles, rules, and regulations of such community, and further agrees to be responsible for any fines. This is why you've heard me say in an earlier video that when we sign a lease with a tenant, if there's an association, we must give the tenant a copy of the rules and regulations. Otherwise, we can't hold them responsible. So here it is right here. Further agrees to be responsible for any fines or penalties levied as a result of failure to do so by tenant, tenant's family, licensees, or guests. Non-compliance with the governing documents shall constitute a violation of this agreement. Unless billed directly to tenant by the association, which rarely happens, such fine shall be considered as additional rent and shall be due along with the next monthly payment of rent. By initialing this paragraph, tenant acknowledges receipt of a copy of the applicable governing documents. We just talked about that. Landlord, at landlord's expense, shall provide tenant with any additions to such governing documents as they become available, so if the rules change in the future. Landlord may, at its option, with 30 days notice to tenant, adopt additional reasonable rules and regulations governing use of the premises and of the common areas, if any. Initial on line 30. Tenant has to be responsible. The tenant is the one living there. They are subject to the rules, whether it's something to do with parking, whether it's noise, whether it's activities or violations at the swimming pool or whatever. The tenant is responsible for any fines or violations, and that is also a paragraph that can be a source of dispute, hence the initials on line 30. Let's move to paragraph 30, which is inventory. It is agreed that the following inventory is now on said premises. All right, in paragraph 30 is about inventory. It is agreed that the following inventory is now on said premises. Folks, notice it says here, check if present, cross out if absent. I know that's a bit of an anomaly for us. We don't typically cross things out, but that's what it wants us to do here. So check if present, cross out if absent. And it goes on to talk about the refrigerator, the stove, the microwave. You can see all of those features there. Please address each and every one of them. Check if present, cross out if absent. Moving on to page 9, but continuing with paragraph 30. It says, tenant acknowledges that any appliances that are on the premises are for tenant's use and convenience. However, in the event of a breakdown of said appliance, tenant acknowledges that property manager, landlord, and or the owners are not responsible for any damages caused to tenants' personal property to include spoilage of food, beverage, or clothing, etc., as a result of said appliance breakdown. So I'm just interpreting this, right? Don't shoot the messenger. But what this says basically is that if appliances are included with a rental property, the appliances are left only for the tenant's convenience. And if those appliances, burn up or melt down or shut down and they cause damage to the tenant's property, sorry, the tenant is on his own in that case. I guess that's why he needs to have renter's insurance, right? Speaking of insurance, how fortuitous of me as we roll into paragraph 31, insurance. Tenant is or is not required to purchase renter's insurance. Well, is. Folks, if you are a landlord, you always want your tenant to have insurance. If you are a tenant, the landlord doesn't have insurance to protect you. So you also want to have your own insurance.